Hello and welcome to our podcast at Get Legally Speaking. Our legal conversation today will be about debt law and individual voluntary arrangements, also known as IVAs. I am here today with barrister Miss Hannah Laithwaite from Lamb Chambers in London. Hannah is frequently instructed by creditors and debtors in all areas of corporate, personal insolvency and debt law, and she regularly appears in court applications to set aside statutory demands, to represent on bankruptcy petitions and in applications involving possession and sale orders. Thank you for joining us, Hannah.
Thank you very much for having me.
Wonderful. Well, debt law, a big area, and I can say it is a big area, and probably more so since 2008, where we started to go into this whole world of recession. Then, there was lots and lots of borrowing going on. Prior to that, there probably still is lots of borrowing going on in this day and age. And so we're starting right from the beginning as a part one podcast to speak about this area of law. And one of the questions that we feel is most frequently asked is, are there laws that can protect me if I'm in debt that I cannot pay? Most people don't know that there are, and this is a quite common question, actually.
Yes, well, the answer is certainly yes, there is. There are a number of tools within the law that will help somebody who's having some issues with debt. If there is a situation where debt collectors and the like, creditors are knocking at the door and harassing somebody who's having some debt problems, there are laws in the harassment realm that can help. But I think what we're going to focus on today is more directly the toolkit that can help an individual manage their debt, and the kind of processes that they can look to, the options for seeing whether they can get some breathing space from those creditors who might be knocking at the door much more frequently than somebody is comfortable with.
No, indeed. And I think that what we automatically assume, or what's automatically assumed, is that if you've signed up for a borrowing, whether it's a credit card or whatever form of debt it is, with a big company or with a corporate company or with any company actually of any size, you've given up all your rights, you've got no rights, and they're now in charge of how they're going to collect that from you.
Well, yes, it can definitely feel like the little man and the big guy putting a lot of pressure on when it comes to a debt, even a reasonably small debt. So it's very important for people to know what their options are. And just as an overview, the key tools that the law provides really to allow somebody to take steps to protect themselves are options such as going for a debt relief order, going for a court administration order, looking into an individual voluntary arrangement, and of course as a perhaps final option, a bankruptcy order. And I know we're going to be speaking a bit more detail about those last two options today.
Yes, no, indeed. I mean, let's start with an IVA, individual voluntary arrangement. What is an IVA and how does it work? What is it?
Well, this is really an agreement between you as a debtor and those people that you owe money to. So we call them creditors in the law. What it is a formal agreement, but it can be quite a flexible arrangement where you look at your assets or you look at your income and try to come to some sort of accommodation with your creditors as to how you might best be able to pay the debt that they're knocking at the door about. So there are two key types. There is an asset-based IVA, and there is an income-based IVA, and the income-based IVAs are really the more popular and more frequently used type of arrangement.
And who decides which one should come into play when you're looking at, well, I want to enter into an IVA, I want to have an IVA agreement with my creditors? Who decides whether it's asset-based or income-based?
At the end of the day, it is you. But there is a lot of assistance out there to help you make that choice. So what you would need to do if you were looking into an IVA is to speak to what we might call a debt advisor, but in legal terms, we usually call them insolvency practitioners.
And there's lots of free help in that regard, isn't there, Hannah?
There is.
There's lots of companies out there that help people look at what is your debt. How can we help you get agreements, IVA agreements or other agreements into place? And they are free. A lot of them are free unless you're going for specific legal advice to a lawyer.
Yes. Yes, there are lots of organisations out there. In the end, if you are going to enter into an IVA, usually there are some costs involved, but they will be considered as part of the arrangement to make sure that you can pay those costs off. It's not a particularly expensive option versus other options, but as I said, it will be wrapped up in the whole arrangement to make sure it's feasible and actually very tailored to the individual who's asking for an IVA to give them some relief, really.
Because I can imagine, I was just mentioning to you earlier before we started our podcast that I had somebody come to me about a few weeks ago saying, look, I've got this debt actually with HMRC, tax debt, that isn't tax debt because a figure was thrown out there and then it's been 4 or 5 years since then, but all these penalties are going on, and all of a sudden what was a few £100s of original debt position is turning into thousands. And somebody said, well, why don't you go into an IVA? They don't know what an IVA is. They're worried about their home, their only asset that they have. And that's why I asked the question, who decides whether it will be your assets will come into it? Because people are worried about things like that, or whether it will just be based on what you earn and how much money you have. So that's very helpful to know that. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say on the question of home, because that's always such an important consideration for people, and that's their personal security at the end of the day. The IVAs are quite good in addressing that concern, because normally an advisor will say, please go away and get a valuation of your home. And the reason they're asking that is not because they want to say you should be selling this to pay your debts, but usually they're asking that question because they're looking to see whether remortgaging is an option for the individual to then release some money from the property, which can help to pay the creditors who are essentially putting pressure on for payment. So it isn't the type of it's an option with much more control for the individual who's arranging it. So the debtor, for the person owing the money. Yes, and it only can come into being if you, the person owning the assets, the house, or looking at essentially applying some of your income to these debts, has to agree to. So it really is within your control as to what proposals are going to be put together, what's a great arrangement. Of course, it has to be reasonable to an extent, because you need creditors to agree to it. Yes,
you can't sort of say I'm going to pay a penny a week and I earn £3,000 a month and I've got lots of disposable income, but I just don't want to pay. This is we're really having this conversation for people who are in trouble, where it is tough. You don't really have that disposable income. Financially, it's not really possible for you to get out of the position of just paying what you owe in the agreement form that you made. And that's why looking at an IVA, an agreement with the debtor, with the help of sort of third party, can help you get through that period and set up an agreement.
Yes, certainly. And what it really is beneficial, in terms of considering options, is that sometimes very difficult for people in that under that pressure of I owe maybe 10 different creditors money, to think who should be paid, who shouldn't be paid, how much should I be paying, how much can I afford to pay and still meet my immediate needs. And what this IVA does is look at the bigger picture and try to give some breathing space by saying, no, those creditors are going to have to wait potentially for a certain amount of time, or they're going to have to receive money by instalments, but it will be an agreement that affects them all at once. And so the individual who owes the money will have a very clear idea about how much each month they are paying to their debts more generally, and it will be channeled in essentially a very organised fashion, which should hopefully relieve some of the stress of it all.
And I mean, because it can become very, very upsetting very quickly. And I tell you, you call these debt companies, you call people that you owe money to, and they can often have very aggressive people on the phone.
Well, yes.
The letters can be very, very upsetting and frequent. In terms of interest, and I know this will obviously come down largely to each individual contract and what you've signed up to and terms and conditions and things, but generally, once you enter into an IVA, what happens to interest on that debt?
Generally, it will come down to the individual terms of the agreement, but generally it will almost put a pause on the accruing interest or accruing penalties, because normally that's one of the conditions that the advisor will be saying we want to make sure is in place for you.
Yes.
Because it stops that spiralling debt that you were talking about earlier. So the whole premise, the way I look at it, is a breathing space agreement. So it stops the debt spiralling and puts a practical way forward as to how that debt might be paid off. And it might not always be paid off in full. Your creditors might be saying, I'll accept a proportion of this debt as long as it's paid on these terms.
Yes.
Or it's simply making sure that there's an instalment plan in place.
And what we've seen as well is that creditors sell the debt to debt collection agencies, and they can be the worst. I mean, in the last 12 months, personally, I have had 2 debt collection agencies write to me about debt that wasn't even owed.
Yes.
And if I wasn't in the business that I am, I would have been beside myself, because they are literally like, within 7 days, we're coming into your home, we're going to take away your possessions, call now, pay now, and then you see some sums and what they're adding on to it. And I mean, I'm very fortunate that both of those were errors, obviously, but the fact that it even happened, and it happened to me, and I felt so shaken up by it, because I thought, how dare you, for a start? And how's the average person who's getting up, trying to get on with their day's work, trying to get out of potentially a very difficult situation financially, supposed to be dealing with these people? Because you call up and the first option is press 1 to pay now. Well, excuse me, but if they could pay now, they wouldn't actually be calling you in the first place, really. So it can really become difficult very quickly. So when we're talking about creditors and the terms of an IVA, so if you had an agent who was helping you get this IVA in place, a creditor has to agree to an IVA, don't they? I mean, they can't say, we're not agreeing to it, we're going to hammer on in the most difficult way. Or can they say, no, we're not agreeing to having an IVA in place for this person who owes us the money?
If enough of them say no, then they can block the IVA. So what happens with an IVA is that you'll put together a proposal, which it will really look like a contract that you might have, tenancy agreement for your home.
Yes.
It will be a written document which sets out what debts you owe and how you are proposing to pay them off. And as I said, often it is an income-based type of IVA. So straightforwardly, you're looking at a percentage of your income being applied to the pot for the creditors to then gradually pay off your debts.
And what you can afford. Obviously, they take into consideration what are your living costs.
Exactly.
They don't just come and say, oh, well, if you earn £1,000 a month, we'll just take £500 of that. They've got to take consideration.
Yeah, it's very tailored.
Yes.
But what happens once you've got that proposal together is the person who's assisting you will call a meeting of the creditors, and they will, and when I say meeting, sometimes it's not always in person, but they will invite them to vote in some fashion, whether electronically or in person, and they will and of those creditors that are choosing to vote, because actually what you'll find is certain creditors who are owed small sums of money might not involve themselves in the process at all, but the creditors who are interested enough to come along and vote, what you need to secure is 75% in value of those creditors that are attending to vote.
Right.
So it isn't a case that they have to accept what you're saying, and there is some give and take. So if a body of creditors say, we're proposing these suggested changes to your IVA to make it usually a bit more profitable for them in terms of getting their debt repaid more quickly, then that's something that then you do a bit of essentially negotiation on, but always bearing in mind
what the agent will do that negotiation for you. Yes,
that's the thing to remember. You pretty much in every case you'll have the assistance of a debt advisor in some capacity who's very used to dealing with these sorts of agreements, and will know what should be agreed to and what is less reasonable. And you can
still take a view, can't you? If you've gone to a debt advisor, of which we've said there's lots of them, you can find a lot of them online actually, and speak to a few until you feel comfortable of who you want to deal with. They put together an IVA for you. They say, right, this is a proposal IVA which you will enter into with a number of your creditors if you have a number of creditors. It could be that you have one, like the gentleman that I was speaking to a few weeks ago with HMRC. And then that's not a done deal until you say, I absolutely agree, I can make those payments, that's reasonable for me, I can do that.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's really in your hands as to whether you sign up to it at the end of the day.
Yes.
And the other thing I suppose to note on that is you might find that actually the creditors suggest something which you've not thought of. So there can really be a dialogue about what's in there.
Yes.
But more often than not, your advisor would be saying we're pretty much putting in a standard form type agreement, but tailored to what assets and income you have versus what debts. But the way it works is very standard form. And a lot of creditors are signed up to IVA protocols where they won't unnecessarily challenge certain points because they've agreed this overarching kind of principle of, if it meets these certain criteria, we'll wave it through.
Yes.
Because at the end of the day, often these will mean a higher return on their debts versus some other form of enforcement against the individual.
Because if my understanding of when companies sell their debt to debt companies is, say they're owed £100, they'll sell the debt for 25, and the debt collector will try to get £50 and make a profit on that.
Yes.
So it's a kind of corporate food chain.
It is.
For debt. So yes, if the company's agreeing through an IVA with you that you're going to pay the £100 and a cap on interest because that's where it's going to stop, that's a lot more money for them, and then selling it on to a debt agency.
Yeah.
So no, I get it. So let's just quickly look at what are the disadvantages of an IVA, Hannah? Are there any obvious disadvantages that you can say, do you know what, these are the disadvantages? And obviously everybody has to individually look at their own personal situation to weigh that up.
I think the most obvious disadvantage which will stick out for people is that if this is a public agreement, so what happens is you'll go on the insolvency register, which can be searched by anyone.
Right.
And so it will have an impact on your credit for a period of 7 years.
So it will go on your credit rating and
yes.
your credit score with Experian, Equifax, whoever you choose to. Well, the two leading ones really are Experian and Equifax, aren't they? So it will go on that you actually entered into an IVA, and it will stay on there for 6 years from the date you finish it?
It will be from when you finish it, because that's when you're essentially cleared of that insolvency procedure. I mean, it's a formal insolvency procedure still.
Yes.
In
and I think that's
legal
very
terms.
important to consider, because I think a lot of people don't realise what happens to their credit reports, their credit rating, with this sort of thing.
Well, yes, and so that's a really key thing to flag to anybody considering it. But at the end of the day, people who tend to be considering this type of arrangement are in a situation where they're choosing between that and a potentially more severe form of having to pay their debts, such as bankruptcy. So it's still a much better option if you're in a position to enter into it. It's generally a better option in terms of impact on your credit rating.
Yes. So we're saying the most obvious disadvantage is that it does appear on your credit report, and it stays on there from 6 years from the day that you've finished the agreement, you've completed your side of the bargain, everything has been paid off. In terms of will I be able to keep my assets if I agree to enter into an IVA? So if it's down to the individual to say, I don't want the involuntary agreement to include anything of my assets and only of my income, would it be the companies, or could it be the agent that's helping you that says, no, actually you've got to put your house into the pot or an asset that you have?
Well, this comes back to the question of control. You don't have to do anything with these IVAs. It is your choice. What your advisor will be saying is this is a reasonable proposal and this isn't very reasonable.
Yes.
If you've got a lot of equity sitting in your house and you're refusing
and you're
to remortgage
and you can afford that remortgage, that all has to obviously come into play.
Exactly, and there will be a degree of disclosure to creditors about that, because they have to have a picture to be able to say, yes, this seems fair on us.
Actually this is being really unreasonable.
So if somebody's got enough equity in their property and the credit rating to be able to remortgage to pay off all of their debts, it's very unlikely that a creditor's going to say, well, I'm going to wait 5 years for my payment of £10 a month. They're not going to think that's a reasonable proposal. So it's always down to the individual, but that individual has to think about what's reasonable, balancing their own interests against those creditors as well.
Yes, no, indeed. Bankruptcy. Now, this is, as you mentioned in the very beginning, it's sort of the end of the road, the last resort. Now, one of the things, what is bankruptcy? Let's just tell everybody, what is bankruptcy?
Bankruptcy, I do consider it an end of the road in terms of individual options for kind of debt relief. There are two ways to get a bankruptcy order, and a bankruptcy order is the court saying this person is adjudicated bankrupt, and that means they are unable to pay their debts. in short form.
And the court will hear you out. I mean, if
Yes.
somebody makes a bankruptcy petition against you, you'll go to court and you'll have an opportunity to tell the court, this is my financial position. So
Yes.
if there is a slight chance that you can pay and you don't need to be
Yes.
made a bankrupt, you don't go in and the big hammer comes down and you're made a bankrupt as such.
No, and that's actually why it's important to engage. If a creditor is sending you letters that talks about bankruptcy proceedings being issued, very important to engage early on, because you can avoid even the application for a bankruptcy order being made if you engage and talk to them about what you can afford and what you can't afford. But there are two routes to getting a bankruptcy order, and one is actually from the individual applying online. So if they've made a decision for themselves that they've investigated their options and actually this is the one that really they need, they aren't going to be in a position to pay off their debts. It's got too much. There just really isn't any other option. They can apply online if they're made
on behalf of themselves to
Yes.
make themselves a bankrupt.
Yes,
right.
yes. The one we on my side of the fence more commonly deal with is where there's an application to court by a creditor.
Right.
And as you said,
so defending in a bankruptcy petition.
Yes. So what might happen is that application's met, the individual debtor, the consumer usually will have the opportunity, like you say, to say whether or not they oppose the application. And how they might do that is actually, and actually it's really important to engage early and think about what you might do. But usually the court asks somebody to put in a statement to explain, for example, what their financial position is and whether they could pay by other means. So often I see it that a debtor is saying, well, I do have this property and I've realised I'm not going to be able to pay these debts other than by selling this property.
So I might agree to sell the property.
Yes. And it's usually better if the person who owns the property has conduct of the sale and has some breathing space to be able to find a buyer at a right price. That's
very important, isn't it? Because if you say, well, I've got the property, just take that, make me a bankrupt, then that property could be sold very quickly at auction.
Exactly.
There may be an opportunity for you to get some equity out of your property, but if it's sold quickly under value, then that opportunity will not arise. I think the last question that I would like us to try and cover in this podcast, Hannah, is how long does a bankruptcy last for against in my name? So if I've been made a bankrupt, I've got to start all over again. Does it go on the credit report? How long does it last for in my name? Where are we on that?
So once the order is made, the usual rule is that it will run for 12 months and then you'll be automatically discharged as a bankrupt. So you'll no longer be considered a bankrupt.
Right.
And so the effect of it is that your debts that were part of the bankruptcy order, so the debts prior to that 12 months date before when you potentially went to court, are all wrapped up in the bankruptcy. And they go. And so what you'll have is a person called a trustee who will look at your assets during that 12 months from the order being made to try and pay off as much as they can.
So all your assets will come into that. You will not have a say. So that's a very important point,
it's much
isn't
less
it?
Control about it.
Yes, you will not be able to say, well, I want to become a bankrupt, but I'm not going to put my house in there. I don't want my car to be in there if you've got no finance on your car and you owe it outright, for example.
Yes.
I don't want my big fancy television in there or my recording studio or whatever it may be. All your assets go into a pot when you're made a bankrupt if you can't come out of that situation.
Yes. So once that so the trustee will look at everything you've got, like you say, and if they think it's worth so if something can be sold to pay debts, they will do that. There are some exceptions. They're not going to go for tools that you use in your daily line of work. Then they're not going to make it difficult for the individual to carry on I was going to say living and working. Sometimes it can have impacts on people's businesses depending on how they're set up. But I think we could talk about that in perhaps another day. But at the end of that 12 months, there is usually this rule of automatic discharge. And I say usually because actually, if the trustee thinks the individual bankrupt debtor has not been cooperating as they should have done, by providing information about their assets, making that information available early on in the process so that the trustee can do their job, they can extend that period. Right. But it is uncommon actually. I don't know the statistics, but it's certainly more often than not there'll be an automatic discharge because people do realise they have to get on with the process.
And by a discharge, we mean that you're no longer a bankrupt. Does it
Yes.
go on your credit report?
So it does, and actually you're really looking into year 7 before you're clear of that. So
After it's discharged?
Yeah, so once you're discharged, it's not you're going to have a period of 6 years where it will just sit there and it'll tell everyone who you might be applying to credit for, so for finance in any realm of your life, that you've been bankrupt in the past, and that can be off-putting for creditors.
Yeah, so it can become very difficult to go and get credit at a nice, cosy rate. I mean, there's so many lenders out there now, aren't there? And you know, the higher the risk you are in terms of if you have been made a bankrupt and you go to get a credit card, you could be paying some very, very high interest rates.
I mean, it's a horrible consequence, really. It can be more expensive to get finance and get credit because of that past history of not being able to pay your debts in the past.
Yes.
So yes, it will have an impact. There's no getting away from that. But there will be a point where it no longer affects the credit. And I really say in year 7 is where you're
7 years
you're
after you've been discharged. That's a long
once
time.
Once you're in that 7th year, that's when it's going to not haunt you so much.
And also some documentation. I mean, you know, because I've seen it on forms where it asks, have you ever been made a bankrupt?
Yes.
Rather than, have you been made a bankrupt in the last 5 years? You know,
Yes.
or have you entered into an IVA in the last 5 years? Some of the questions on documentation is, have you ever? And that also can work against you, because say it has been 10 years from the date of your discharge, and you're under an obligation to disclose that you have. You obviously have got to be honest.
You do have to be honest.
You've been in that position, and so I think bankruptcy is not to be taken lightly.
That's exactly it. It unfortunately has to be the option for a lot of
last,
people. But if you can look at the other options, and I mentioned about engaging early.
Yes.
It's really important if you are struggling with the debts to think about your options early on, because you can just avoid quite a long road to bankruptcy if you get involved early on and start
and even get a third party involved,
yes.
Get those debt advisors in place.
Yes.
You know, as I said, there's lots of free help on that and information, so that you don't need to go down the road of bankruptcy. I mean, I can understand, you know, I've heard in the past when people have said, oh, but all my debts will go away and that will be it. But you just don't know when in the future you'll want to apply for more debt. You'd want to get a house or a property or a credit card or a car or store card, you know, anything of any kind, and it could really affect you. It could be detrimental to your position to be able to get that. Hannah, we haven't covered the half of the questions that we wanted to, but I'm ever so grateful that we got this far. And I know that in part 2, we need to look at the other alternatives in debt law to IVAs and bankruptcy and lots of other areas. So thank you ever so much
thank you.
For joining us today. Don't forget to click and subscribe to our podcasts, and you can find us on Twitter, Facebook and LinkedIn by searching Get Legally Speaking. Also visit our website at getlegallyspeaking.com. Thank you very much for listening.